Good morning, guys. Welcome back. We're going to continue on with Unit 6 today, and we were talking about innate immunity yesterday. I left off on this slide here, and just to remind you what we're talking about when we say innate immunity, it's the immune system and the defenses you have when you're first born. So every human being healthy human beings should have these defenses. And we're talking about our first line of defenses. Right here, which is going to be our skin and mucous membranes. So it's going to be physical and chemical barriers, basically. And then we talk about our second line of defenses, which are going to be our internal defenses: phagocytes, natural killer cells, inflammation, antimicrobial proteins, and fever. So let's get going. Okay, so first we'll talk about our first line of defenses. And these first line of defenses are going to be these three things right here. Okay, it's going to be physical barriers, chemical barriers, and then finally microbial antagonism. The figure right here on the right hand side is a really good summary of physical and chemical defenses. Not only does it list them, so you can see here lysozyme, you can see here our normal flora, skin, pH changes, and so on, but it also points out where in the body that these defenses occur. So although they're pointed out here, and this is a really great summary, it's also contained in a table in the next slide. Alright, here we go. So this is a really great table, and I expect you guys to have a very good understanding of this table. On this part of the table right here, we're talking about physical defenses. And physical defenses mean how we're going to physically prevent microorganisms from causing infection. So on this side of the table here, you'll see a list, and all of these things represent physical barriers that prevent microorganisms from causing infection or causing disease. So what I expect you guys to be able to take from this figure here is this list. You should know this list, and on this side of the table, this right here, this is going to be an explanation of how each one of these happens. So for example, if I pick mucus, that's a first line physical defense against microbial invasion. I should expect you guys to know that what mucus does is it will trap microbes, so bacteria, viruses, in the respiratory and the gastrointestinal tract, and it'll prevent them from entering tissues and causing infection. So I would expect you guys to know this list and also how it works. Now if we move over to the second part of the table, we're going to have a look at chemical defenses. So we've got sebum, lysozyme, gastric juice, and vaginal secretions. All of these are chemical borders or chemical barriers that prevent microbes from entering our tissues. Generally these are found in kind of vulnerable places or surrounding mucous membranes. These act as another barrier against the invasion by microorganisms. So again, I would expect you guys to know this list, and then also over here the explanation on how it works. So if we take lysozyme for an example, lysozyme is an antimicrobial substance. It's almost like an enzyme, and we can find it in our perspiration, so our sweat, in our tears, in our saliva, nasal secretions, and general tissue fluid, and it basically acts against any microbes that find themselves in those positions. So you guys should understand the list of the chemical factors as well as how they work. Down here, it's kind of a little bit of an explanation showing you different parts of the body and how these physical and these chemical antimicrobial agents would work. Alright, so that was physical and that was chemical barriers. The third part of our first line defense is microbial antagonism. Now the word antagonism means opposite or to oppose. if you think about your upper arm and you have your bicep muscle and your tricep muscle, these do opposite things. If you flex your bicep muscle, your tricep relaxes and your hand moves towards your head. If you flex your tricep muscle and relax your bicep, your arm will move away from your head. So they do opposite things. What we're talking about when we say microbial antagonism is we're relying on our normal or natural flora, so the organisms that live on our body and in our body anyways. They rarely cause us infection. They kind of live with us symbiotically. They're already there. They're already kind of stimulating the immune system to a little bit of an extent, but they don't cause us disease. So if we have healthy microbes that are living in parts of our body already, it makes it more difficult for opportunistic bacteria or pathogens to move in and cause infection. So when we say microbial antagonism, what we're talking about is having a happy, healthy, normal flora, and that's taken up all the space that's available, so we don't get these pathogens moving in that can cause us trouble. So if you look at the figure down here, on the healthy side, we've got normal gut physiology, and if you look here, we get normal microbes that are, happily existing, the little green rods. We have cells here that are quite healthy. They're not causing any inflammation or anything like that. If we don't have normal functioning gut bacteria, you'll see we have more of those cells that are causing inflammation that are caused by stress. As a result of that, we can have these different color or these different types of cells moving in. So these yellow rods that you see here, and they could be pathogens and they could cause stress or disease. So having healthy normal flora will help restrict the growth of invading bacteria. Now, this is another great slide that gives a bit of a summary of our innate immune system. So on this side here, we get a list of different parts of our innate immune system. Whoops, sorry about that. There we go. And on this side over here, we see different species of bacteria that represent our normal flora and where they live, or where they can live on and in the body. So it's a comparison between our normal innate immune system and then our symbiotic bacterial species that live on different parts of our body. Okay, so that was our first line of defense. Those were barriers. So the idea behind our first line is to prevent anything from crossing into our tissues that can cause infection. If we have a pathogen that's able to get past our first line of defense, then we have our second line of defense. These are also part of our innate immune system, so every healthy person should have these responses. They're non-specific again, but they are internal defenses. So there's 4 different types of secondary defense: phagocytosis, inflammation, fever, and antimicrobials. There's a good summary of that in this table right here, but we'll go through them in the next few slides. The first one we'll talk about is phagocytosis. You should be able to remember what phagocytosis is from previous biology courses, but phagocytosis is how a cell, oftentimes we say, eats. When we're talking about our immune system, we have cells that are specifically for phagocytosis, and they move through the body and they recognize cells or particles or organisms that should not be there, and they recognize those as what we call non-self. So these cells, these phagocytes, they have the ability to recognize things that shouldn't be in the body, that aren't part of a normal healthy body. And what they do is they go along and they engulf them. They phagocytose them. So for example, in this picture here, we've got a bacteria. Of course, the cell recognizes that's not supposed to be there. It will approach it and it will engulf it into a phagosome. So inside the phagosome, we've got the bacterial cell and we've got a tiny membrane around it. So even though this bacteria is now in the cell, it's protected. The cell is protected by having that membrane around it. Now, if you guys think back to biology 1200, you'll remember what a lysosome is. A lysosome is a vacuole or vesicle inside the cell, and inside that vesicle there are a bunch of enzymes in there that can do some serious damage to different things. So what's going to happen now is this lysosome is going to combine with the phagosome, with the bacteria inside it. When it does, all those enzymes are going to be released onto the bacteria, and they're going to tear that bacteria apart, break it down. Once it does that, everything inside this phagolysosome that's been digested, it's not of any benefit to the cell whatsoever, so the cell gets rid of it through exocytosis. This part right here, all the bits and pieces of bacteria, that's going to be stuff that it's going to be filtered out through the lymphatic system or through the kidneys, and it's going to be excreted as urine. So lots of times when you're sick and the doctors tell you to go home, get lots of rest, drink lots of fluids, the reason why they do that is because the more you go to the bathroom, the quicker and faster, more efficiently you get rid of all of this stuff here that your immune system is turning over. Now, we have more than one phagocyte in our body. We've got many different types of phagocytes. So you can have a look here and you can see we've got granulocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells. They're all phagocytes, as in they all go around the body and they eat stuff that isn't supposed to be there, but they do things a little bit slightly different. Granulocytes will be the first ones into an infection, and they'll eat stuff until they die. Macrophages and the dendritic cells, they come along after, and what's really important about these two cells here is that these cells help activate our adaptive immune system, which is what we'll talk about in the second half of this unit. Okay, so that was the first part of our second line of defenses when we talked about phagocytosis. The second part of our second line of defenses is inflammation. A lot of things happen in inflammation. It's a defensive response that can happen in almost all body tissues, and it responds to damage. So if your body's damaged, your tissue's damaged in some way, it could be an infection, it could be a cut, it could be a burn, it could be anything that damages tissue, you will have an inflammation or inflammatory response. And what it does is it helps dispose of microbes and foreign materials, it helps to dilute toxins, and it helps to promote healing. So if you look down here in the box, you can see there's a lot of different steps that are involved in the inflammatory response, and there's a lot of things that it does. So we'll talk about that as we go through the next couple of slides. Alright, so have a look at the picture here, and you can see the person in that picture has got some inflammation, some pretty serious inflammation happening on one of their fingers. You can typically see inflammation. It's pretty easy to recognize. The tissue turns quite red. There's a lot of pain associated with it. If you touch it and you feel it, it feels hot, so the temperature is increased there at the site of inflammation. And we get swelling, which is a medical word for swelling is edema. So these are what a typical inflammation response looks like if you could see it on the surface of the body. Now, there's 4 different steps that go on in the in the inflammation response. So we've got 4 panels down here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll just go through them real quick. The first thing that's going to happen is you're going to get damage. Okay, so in this case we've got a pin, and then we end up with bacteria that have crossed through our skin, through our barrier. This is going to happen, or this is going to result in a step called chemotaxis. Now, chemotaxis is when the cells here that are damaged are going to release all kinds of chemical signals. Some of those signals are going to be histamines or prostaglandins, and that's going to signal for a whole bunch of things, other things to happen. The first thing will happen is, if we move to the second stage, is we'll have vasodilation. That means that the blood vessels around the injured site get bigger. When they do, they tend to be a little bit leaky, so they start to change their permeability. When it does that, we get things leaving the bloodstream and moving into the tissue. So blood clotting agents, for example, will also get different types of white blood cells moving in to the site of the injury.